Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
There's an old saying that when the U.S. sneezes, Canada catches a cold. Well, since the U.S. election, Canadians seem to be not feeling so well from an economic standpoint. After the Bank of Canada started to lower interest rates this summer and inflation started to cool down, well, consumer confidence was showing a steady pace of recovery to somewhat optimistic levels. Well, that all seemed to have changed with President-elect Donald Trump's victory on November 4th, now set to return to the White House. As pollster Nik Nanos put it in his weekly tabulation of such things, positive views on the future strength of the Canadian economy have declined a significant 8 points, coincidentally with the ending of the U.S. presidential election, and consumer confidence overall now continues to decline. In announcing the plans for the GST holiday, Finance Minister and Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland described it as a vibecession, where Canadians aren't feeling too good about the economy right now, even though the government says the economy is actually improving. So is everything right now just based on a feeling of uneasiness? I'm Mike Eppel. Today on the Big Story podcast, we're looking at the mood of the country and what it's going to take to make us feel better. To do that, I'm joined by the aforementioned Nik Nanos, the chief data scientist at Nanos Research. Nik, thanks for joining us today.
Great to join you and all your listeners.
The lead up to the U.S. election, Nik, we saw here in Canada your statistics indicating that Canadian consumers were feeling a little bit better about the economy this fall. Consumer confidence was on the rise. Since the U.S. vote, however, your weekly statistics on consumer confidence have been dropping quite dramatically. Can it be that simple that Canadians are looking south and are showing concern, worry, what have you, about the results of the U.S. vote?
Absolutely. You know, when we look at the longer-term trend line in the Bloomberg Nanos Consumer Confidence Index, for a big part of 2024, as interest rates went down, stabilized and went down, Canadians started to feel a little better. Consumer confidence rose and went into positive territory. But what we have seen is that almost immediately with the election of Donald Trump, materially negative pressure on consumer confidence, it going down. And, you know, since he's done, because I guess it's policy by tweet, even though he's the president-elect, but even since he's tweeted about the 25% tariff on American goods, on Canadian goods coming into the U.S., what we've seen basically is, basically an 8-point slump since he was elected in consumer confidence, where people are thinking that the Canadian economy increasingly is going to be weaker in the next 6 months. So a big it's a big chill effect.
Well, you say the word psychological because there really hasn't been the economic statistics, at least not yet, to back that up. But it could, in this case, be a self-fulfilling prophecy.
I think that's what we have to worry about. And, the thing is this is where psychology and consumer sentiment can convert into real life behavior. Because, let's face it, if someone has planned a major purchase, they can afford the major purchase, they need the major purchase, they're about to do it, and then something happens in terms of the economy, interest rates going up, perhaps job security being at risk and stuff like that. What happens is that purchases that people on paper can and should be making get delayed. And we have to worry about this negative psychology converting itself into actual consumer behavior and fulfilling kind of the negative view that people have. So we really got to watch out for this.
Well, the past week we had heard from the Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland talking about, as she put it, economists calling this a vibe session. Not a recession, but a vibe session, which is based on feelings. So does she have a point there? Or is that, kind of telling Canadians what you're feeling? It's more about how you feel and not the reality of everyday households and what they have to deal with in this economy.
Yeah, I think Minister Freeland does have a point, but that doesn't mean that it's going to stop people or delay people from making purchases. So yes, the diagnosis is correct, right? Because, when you look on paper, things do look stable, but what people see is risk on the horizon. And, you can't underestimate the chill effect that the Donald Trump announcement is going to have. Like, let's face it, if you're an American organization looking at potentially investing in Canada, you're going to be probably having second thoughts because of the potential risk. So, the reality is that whether Donald Trump institutes what he says that he's going to do, these 25% tariffs on Canadian goods coming into the U.S., the reality is that it's probably not only done damage psychologically in consumers, it's probably done damage on potential investment in Canada from American firms looking at investing more in Canada as opposed to investing in the United States.
Well, let's just talk a little bit more about the household end of things, because there are so many Canadian households right now. You see the food bank numbers. You see, it's kind of a have not kind of situation where, 50% of the population is working and living paycheck to paycheck. The other half, maybe they got money in the markets or they own their own home or what have you, a little bit better. But is there that risk of the spillover effect? A lot of people are struggling right now, but the people who might, continue to spend, is that the next kind of tipping point for an economic slowdown if they really start to feel it?
Yeah, absolutely. And the reality is that even when we ask Canadians about whether their finances are better or worse off, about 40% of Canadians, or 4 out of every 10, say that their finances are worse off than a year ago. And about 4 out of every 10 also think that the economy is going to get weaker. But the thing is that whether you're rich, middle income, or lower income, you're not an expert, but that our relationship with the United States is our most important trading relationship. That, when that relationship flourishes, that's usually good news in terms of the Canadian standard of living and the Canadian economy. And that when it's at risk, that's a problem. And, people still remember 2016, what we call Trump 1, the version 1.0, where during the USMCA renegotiations, it was a very rough ride for the Canadians and the Mexicans. And, it's pretty clear that Donald Trump is going to take a tough hand to try to get as much as he can out of the upcoming discussions on the renewal of the USMCA.
Well, that does raise a lot of questions about if those tariffs go in, because, again, the initial threat, if you will, during the election campaign was for a 10% tariff, and now we're looking at the risk of 25. And again, we'll see if this actually happens or if there is room to negotiate between now and Inauguration Day. But from a business investment standpoint, are you looking at this as an owner-operator going, I don't know what to do at this point, because once we're into 2025, all bets are off. We could be dealing with a major border trade issue that, if you're supposed to be working on improving productivity and making forward-thinking guesses on where to invest, that's almost next to impossible at this point.
Yeah, I think probably if you're any type of Canadian enterprise thinking about investments, either in Canada or the United States, if the U.S. is one of your big customers, you're probably putting everything on pause until you find out what actually happens. There is a piece of good news, or potentially good news in all of this, is that this 25% proposed tariff on Canadian goods put a little asterisk. Donald Trump has put an asterisk on that because he's linked it to fentanyl production, his claim about fentanyl production in Mexico and Canada coming into the U.S., and he's also linked it to immigration, asylum, all that kind of stuff, border issues. So if we're thinking of Donald Trump as a negotiator, perhaps the reality is that if Canada, for example, can address or say something related to fentanyl production, whatever that might be, in Canada, that may be going into the U.S., that they want to crack down on that or prosecute that or whatever, that would probably give Donald Trump the latitude to say that he's won something already, and then to enter into the negotiations. And the same thing on the border. If the Canadian government comes back and says, you know what, the border is a shared responsibility. We're happy to work with you on maintaining the integrity of the border and on illegal crossings, whether it's illegal crossings from the U.S. into Canada or from Canada into the U.S., that would give Donald Trump, for him, he'd probably say he's won, right? Got them to crack down on fentanyl production in Canada and brought the Canadians to the table to talk seriously about the border. So, there is a bit of an off-ramp if this is really a negotiation to take down the tariff talk.
Well, I found it interesting that Mexico's leadership immediately said that they were going to limit border crossings. Again, Trump on Truth Social made comment about that. Does this put the federal government Does the onus come to them to say that they have to be more vociferous, more out front facing, and saying we're going to deal with this again, just to bring back to the idea of consumers not feeling confident because it's this uncertainty. They don't know where anything is right now.
Well, the twist in Sheinbaum, the Mexican leader, is that she also tweeted to say that's actually not what she talked about. That there seems to be two versions of the same telephone call between the leader of the United States and the leader of Mexico. But, let's face it, if Americans were producing fentanyl and it was illegally crossing into Canada, the Canadian Prime Minister would call out the U.S. and say, hey, we have a problem. So, the thing is for these situations, if they do exist, and to the extent that they exist, it is a valid thing for the leader of one country to talk to the leader of another country on this. And I also think that it's a valid thing to talk about the border. So I think for the Canadian government, they could easily say, well, we have a zero tolerance for illegal fentanyl production in Canada, whether it's for Canadians and Americans or anybody, and we're happy to work with the Americans on cracking down on that. And then to also say the same thing, that, we have a shared border. The border is not just a Canadian responsibility. It is a Canadian and an American responsibility. And we're happy to work with the Americans to make sure that the border works properly in terms of the movement of people that should be crossing the border, and also managing the movement of people that should not be crossing the border. So, and I don't think that's a sign of weakness. I think that's basically calling the reality of what it is on both of those particular issues, but to basically say, yeah, if that's a problem, we're ready to crack down on that. But let's start a dialogue and remember that we're in a partnership, that it's just not the burden of the Canadians to maintain the integrity of the border. The Americans have to take their responsibility seriously also.
I guess it's just the bull in the china shop, although maybe that was to be expected, just the way Trump operates.
Yeah, well, you know what? That's the way he operated in his first term. That's the way he's going to operate now. That's the way he works. But I think what we have to remember is that his primary frame is that of a negotiator. So he comes in first, and he comes in fast, and he comes in hard. And then he's going to test you to see how you respond. If you roll over, then he's kind of won. But if you push back strategically, but show that you have some flexibility, then the real negotiation can start. But I think what we have learned is that even though he is the president-elect, he's in a rush to do stuff. If he can accomplish anything as president-elect, I'm sure he's going to want on January 20th when he is sworn in as the next president of the United States, he would love to say, you know what? I tweeted that we're going to slap on a 25% tariff on Canada. And you know what? Now the Canadians are talking to us about fentanyl production in Canada and whether it's going into the United States. And now Canadians are talking to us about the border. They weren't doing that under the previous administration. I think that's his end game, that he wants to be able to say something on January the 20th.
Let's switch the focus a little bit, if we could, to, again, although coming back to consumer confidence, this GST holiday that is going to take effect on December 14th. Is that the pick-me-up that maybe consumers needed? Is the timing for that right? Or could maybe that have been in effect already to catch the Black Friday and holiday sale season earlier?
I don't know. I think a 60-day tax holiday on selected items. I don't think that's really a long-term solution. I think for a lot of Canadians, it's going to look like a government desperate to stay in power and willing to spend money and do anything to stay in power by, sending out $250 checks or having a HST, GST holiday for 60 days. And, let's face it, if Canadians are given a check for $250, they'll take it. They're not stupid. They're going to take it. But that doesn't mean that they're going to vote for the Liberals. And, the thing is if we kind of go back into the time machine back in 2015, the Conservatives tried to hold on to power after being in power for, since 2006. And in 2015, near the end of their mandate, they had those family checks that they started pushing out the door, thinking maybe people feel a little better about Stephen Harper and the Conservatives. Well, that didn't work out too well for Stephen Harper. There's nothing to suggest that these initiatives will work. And you know what? It could backfire because there are provinces that are going to be out of revenue and that have been complained about not being consulted. now that they're giving the $250 to people who are working people, seniors are like, hey, what about us? And so on the implementation front, it's realistically a failure already. Well-intentioned, but an epic failure.
And again, it was the quick announcement and time frame that it had to be put into effect for the people who have to roll this out. I mean,
And how are businesses going to deal with this? Small businesses, right? Like, there's going to be costs and time to do something for 60 days, right? So let's face it, small businesses, if this moves forward, some small businesses will be annoyed because they'll be incurring all the work in order to implement this so that their customers can have a 60-day break on some items, and then they'll have to go back to the way it was before. So I'm not even sure how this gets through the Department of Finance. And it maybe speaks to what the relationship is between the political government and the civil service.
all right. Well, you'll be at the forefront of tracking all of this to see how it actually goes over. How it plays with the public. Thanks for talking to us today.
Take it easy. Have a great one.
Thank you. That was Nik Nanos, the Chief Data Scientist at Nanos Research. Just a reminder of a great listening experience for you. You can listen to the Big Story podcast anytime on Seeker. That's Seekr. I'm Mike Eppel. Thanks for listening.